Welcome to the S2 Cognition Podcast. S2 is the official cognitive evaluation in sports, from youth to pro, where athletes and coaches build to win.
Welcome in, everyone, to the S2 Cognition Podcast. Today, Coach Dub Maddox and Coach Will Hewlett continue their conversation about quarterbacks and on-field post-snap decision-making with the two S2 co-founders, Brandon Alley and Scott Wiley. If you missed the first conversation where we covered the visual processing element of playing quarterback, we will link it to the show notes of this episode, so be sure to check it out. Today, Dub, Will, Scott, and Brandon dive into the read-react decisions of playing quarterback, which covers what we describe as visual learning or spatial memory, which is how an athlete is able to spatially take 2D information, plays, and spacing, and then translate it to 3D or on the field. Instinctive learning, which is how well an athlete picks up on subtle cues and tendency of the opposing player as the game goes along. Your brain is constantly stitching these things together. And decision complexity, which is how many if-then, or as Dub describes, this-unless decisions a quarterback is able to hold and execute efficiently in his decision-making. For those that are new here, welcome. We're excited to have you. And for those that are returning listeners, we always appreciate your support. To help continue our growth, we ask that you subscribe, rate, and review our show. We hope you enjoy diving into quarterbacks' read-react decision skills today.
All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about read-react skills for quarterbacks. We have three of those skills in the battery, some of which, are not necessarily things you're going to be able to work on, but maybe about how you approach an athlete, how you coach up an athlete. And so if we get through these three and we have extra time, we can discuss some of the things that we've talked about in past discussions, like rhythm for quarterbacks and how important that can be, and judging angles and things like that. So the first skill set that we measure, we call visual learning. And visual learning really is being able to take a quick snapshot and maintain that visual representation. And I think what's important about the visual representation is that it's from a spatial layout perspective as well, right? And we often talk about alignment and spatial proximity with quarterbacks and receivers and things like that. And so what we hear mostly from coaches with athletes with low visual learning scores is that they have difficulty taking new installs and learning them in the classroom or a whiteboard or film room, and then being able to walk out on the field and knowing sort of the alignment of things. So where the slot might be in relationship to the tackle, or where he should be, or where things should be aligned in space. I mean, you guys have seen quarterbacks with low and with high visual learning scores. How do you feel like this might impact your athlete and how you might approach those athletes?
Yeah, so if I understand it right, you're talking about just going from a classroom setting and then going onto the field and then not making the connections of alignments of players or
Right.
the spacing of a concept. I think it's big. I think it's a reason why we do more of our installs on the field. Getting guys out there and actually walking through it, and in doing more interactive types installs as opposed to sitting in a seat and looking at a screen. I think the VR technology that we've implemented has helped extensively doing installs and teaching new concepts based from that perspective. I mean, the biggest thing that I've seen a jump with our kids in terms of their ability to accelerate learning is teaching it from the lens that are looking through. I call it the shooter's view from a quarterback perspective. So biggest thing that I've probably learned the last couple of years was I was teaching for many years from a 30,000 foot view, from a drone view or a press box view in terms of installs, or an end zone angle view, and not understanding that my quarterbacks that have maybe a low visual learning score or cognitive ability couldn't translate, looking at from a drone view from the actual view they're looking for. So when we get on the field, it's like a totally different concept to them. So, I now shoot video from a 360 GoPro from the helmet for 7-on-7s for team, and try to teach through their lens as much as possible. So that's two things that we've done is field installation and also, filming installs and teaching installs from the shooter's view perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we've never really gotten to the space where quarterbacks are learning from their perspective. What VR technology are you using, Doug?
So we partnered with a company called Reps. They've been around for probably 4 or 5 years. They're tied into a few Power Five schools as well. We're one of the few high schools that actually use it, but it's a growing product. And so they were guys. One was in special forces for a number of years and has experience with how they used VR training and special forces training. And then another guy was based out of Stanford. He was a G at Stanford, and so they partnered together and developed this technology that's it's pretty amazing.
Do you feel like it helps all athletes? It just speeds up the learning process?
Yeah, I think it does. I think the main thing is just, your athletes are put in the actual context. They're training from the context they are in a real world environment is the big thing. The challenge is, when you start to move with it, it's hard to make this, to film the scenarios when the movements, it's easier from a quarterback platform, pocket platform, to use because he's making decisions from a static pocket for the most part.
Right.
When you put it on a safety or a linebacker receiver and you're filming those scenarios, it gets a little bit different, but it's very good for the quarterback.
I could jump in a little bit. I think one of the interesting things about, this kind of speaks to me in terms of looking through the quarterbacks that have success in college and in high school, and maybe this speaks a little bit to the simplicity of certain offenses that allow guys to have to, essentially digest smaller amounts of new looks, right? So maybe, some of the adaptions coaches or teams could make, or in terms of just, thinking from a systematic standpoint, why you see certain offenses have a lot of success in certain areas in college and high school, simplicity in the offense, I think allows probably players that lack in that visual learning, they don't have to have they see probably less stuff over the course of a game if you're doing less stuff. Now, obviously there can be negatives to that, right, in the chess game, but, maybe that's a good explanation why, potentially the air raid offense will have success to a certain extent from a passing standpoint, right? They've got however many concepts they have, they're pretty simplistic in formations. And so you start to see the same things over and over and over again. I guess the chess match, the interesting part, when you face a defensive coordinator that understands that, and then, shows different looks to that formation. But I think it's probably an interesting observation for coaches to make in terms of structuring your offense potentially more around your quarterback, based on their scores and what maybe deficiencies in certain areas.
What do you think, just from a coaching standpoint, do you think that it's important to have a very complex offense? I mean, obviously, especially at the high school level, you get a lot of physical kids with a lot of arm talent. And I think the feeling today is almost feels like it's to overcomplicate things, which is great if you've got a kid who can handle it, but does it absolutely have to be that complicated?
I think that's the challenge with any domain. We're talking, quarterbacks now, football, but we can talk business, we can talk anything. It's always, taking things and making them too complex because we always, that's kind of what we do. I think with visual learning and spatial memory, I think a lot of it is on the coach. I think a lot of coaches don't know how the mind and the brain works and how vision works. And so, they set up their offense or how they teach it that does not connect with how the mind and the brain work under pressure. I think coaches need to study more on how, cognitively the brain works under pressure and how language can simplify it and giving quarterbacks better frames of reference to process space and time is my opinion.
Yeah, coaches love to fall in love with the romance of the perfect play on the whiteboard, and the complexity, the high technical side of things. And I think there's probably a difference between being complex and just being difficult, and then being complex but having a way to simplify it in your teaching methodology. And I think that's probably where you see the greater coaches have more success, is they can take a complex concept offense, and package it in a manner where it's less complex. And I think, maybe some coaches get a little bit, you get a unicorn that comes through that is able to handle anything you throw at them, and you kind of just think, well, that's how they all should be. When the reality, it's not that way. So, yeah, I think Dub nailed it in terms of we love to make things more complicated than they need to be, just because it's fun to sound really smart.
Yeah, I was going to say that certainly we can overcomplicate things on the offensive side, but it's complicated enough because, as you guys have alluded to, defenses don't just adopt a position and stay there. They're not stationary bodies in the field of vision. And this is one of the complicating things is a quarterback may look over and see where everyone's lined up and the positioning and the spacing to the right side of the field, take a snapshot and then maybe redirect their attention to the other side of the field. You're having to hold in mind where everyone was on the right side of the field. And you're assuming they're kind of stationary. And this is where this visual learning, low spatial memory can also creep in is you move to the left and then you come back center or even back to the right just to double check and somebody's moved. And the ability to maintain a good representation of where they were allows you to make to detect when someone has moved or spacing has shifted and changed. And so the ability to update your kind of working what you're holding on to, that spatial information as you're looking around and surveying the backfield and the defense, and they're shifting. I mean, that's an important cognitive challenge that quarterbacks face because they're constantly having to update. It's not just recognize a static positioning and then move on. There's updates and shifts. And so have you seen that? And the lower visual learning seem to maybe miss things or miss certain shifts or don't appreciate the spatial adjustments that have been made as quickly or as effectively.
Just to build on that, Scott, even if it were a static image, we all vary in our ability to maintain that actual fidelity of that image. And the number one piece that goes away first is spatial location. So if we were to look at a spatial, let's say a golfer as an example, were to look at the spatial layout of where all the traps are, bunkers are, where the pin is, he turns and looks, it all becomes distorted. Some people can maintain that crisp, high fidelity image, but the vast majority of us, the spatial piece of it gets scrambled. So even if it were static, it still needs to be updated at times. So, I mean, that is one aspect of learning, right? Is that sort of traditional install learning, playbook learning. The next thing we're going to move into is this, what we term instinctive learning, which is not something you're going to study for. It's not something that you're looking at. It's the unscripted looks. It's the picking up on subtle tendencies and cues of your opponent, and just noticing probabilities and patterns early on in the game, right? And so, for a quarterback coach, it might be okay. We've gone through two series, and you're not seeming to grasp that every time they bring the safety in the A gap, here's what's happening, right? And so they're not picking up on those subtle things. And we talked a little bit last week about, with the perception speed, noticing subtle things about the way a defensive back may position himself or position his feet. All of that plays into the instinctive learning piece too. I'm just going to assume, but I'd love to hear from you guys. Do you have certain quarterbacks that you feel like they just pick up on things and they can adjust quickly, or other guys you really have to get on them and tell them, hey man, you got to be noticing this. Every time this happens, this is what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see it. I think that's probably maybe one of the easier things to evaluate without having the data is being in tune with the game and kind of as they settle down and then being able to not get caught twice. I think that's something you can see kind of unfold in practice, unfold in games, and I think it's our job as coaches to try to put players in those types of positions where we're going to try to get you, and certainly it makes it you can move quicker through your install, quicker through your offense in terms of what you want to accomplish. when you have an athlete that's instinctually learns well, you can probably be take a little bit more of the mindset, like, they may get them once, but they're not going to get them twice, and they're going to get the flow. But that's probably one of those really, like, that's a great trait to have as a coach, because it probably takes a little bit of pressure off in terms of having to constantly prep and make them aware. If anything, the additional prep and language probably might cloud their decision making when you're constantly trying to tell them what's going to happen and then it doesn't happen. So letting them kind of feel it out. Someone with a high instinctive learning score probably thrives actually on just stepping back as a coach and letting them kind of take over. They'll do things in the game where you're just like, wait, what are they doing? Oh, that's what they're doing. So those types of moments. So there's probably something there with, you get one of those with some high creativity, and you can, really get after it with a player that has those traits.
That's interesting. You could potentially coach that out of a kid if you are so dogmatic and rigid with your system and your reads and your decisions, and you don't give a little bit of room for a kid to adapt and their brain to naturally detect, identify, notice the less obvious things, and adjust on the fly. Interesting.
Deb, I bet you got some thoughts on that from your experience of calling plays
Yeah,
over.
I think the best quarterbacks that I've trained are naturally high on the instinctive learning, scale. Uh, just the innate ability to feel space and process time. Obviously, as a coach, you come in and you give them a few coaching points and bookends on, how to accelerate that, but you kind of just let them. It's free play. Is a good way to describe it. They just have a natural ability to go out and just free play and just have an innate ability to understand space time relationships within concepts, and that's the years that are really fun as a coach, because it alleviates the pressure off of you. Um, I think the challenge I've had early on as a coach is I started out coaching guys like that, and then I had a couple years where I didn't have kids that were high on the instinctive learning scale, and so I really had to find ways to bring them up uh, and kind of bookend those weaknesses. So you had to be more in a very explicit style of coaching when you have those
Yeah.
players that are low, and I had to go deep into book knowledge of just the DNA of the game and a lot of rules, and so that was the self-discovery on my part, is knowing kind of what kid you have, and then okay, which direction as a coach do I need to go this year based on his instinctive learning score.
Yeah, that's definitely that's our strategy for helping those athletes is just you've got to turn the implicit or the instinctive to explicit learning. You've got to point it out to them. I think this is a good time to talk about the fact that a lot of high school athletes don't know how to watch film. They don't know what to look for, those kind of things. And so you really need to do that with a mentor who can point out those subtle things, point out those cues that they should be looking for to make it more explicit.
Yeah, here's the challenge that I run into, and for people listening, I mean, maybe you can agree or put yourself in their shoes, is a lot of times experts, um, they don't have the framework and the language to basically get a novice to see things on their level. And what I mean by that is, like, when I first started coaching, I was trying to find the best ways to teach my quarterback on how to know what open looks like, how to increase anticipation, how to understand space and time. And so one offensive coach I went to, who was a brilliant offensive coordinator at the Division I level, I asked him, how does your quarterback know what open is? And he kind of was stunned by the question. And he said, well, he just knows. And I was like, well, I was kind of defeated by his answer, because that doesn't help me. Like, I can't just recruit another kid that just knows. I don't have another Power Five kid on the bench that I can put in if my starter doesn't know what open is. If he's not a, instinctive learner, or he's not high on the chart there. So that was kind of frustrating, but it set me on a journey to try to find an explicit process and core frames of reference and a common language to help build, that ability, or book in that ability in kids that are low with instinctive learning. So again, I think that's the challenge for a lot of coaches is they have a lot of experience and they're experts and they can see things, but they may not know how they're doing it. The process, how do we work backwards to get a kid who can't to see things at my level?
That's got to be a huge challenge. Yeah, so now we're moving into an area where it kind of mixes that space between it's the true read react and moves into the control system, our decision complexity. And, Dub, I read when I was reading, what is open, that first section really drove it home for me is that was what you were getting at, right? And the decision process was if the DB covers the curl, throw to the flat. If he covers the flat, throw to the curl. Well, then what happens if he just stands there, right? Then what happens? Well, then we got to go back to the backside. And before you're knowing it, you're adding 20,000 layers of what could possibly happen. Well, that's decision complexity wrapped up in a nutshell is how many or how what is the burden for this athlete to layer on those if then statements. So if the safety does this and the corner does this, here's where you're throwing to. But if the backer drops in coverage and the corner does this, here's where you're throwing to. And some athletes can filter through that without difficulty whatsoever. And some athletes struggle with it. And what we find at the lower levels is it typically comes in the form of hesitation. Just because they can't filter through it and they just need a little extra time to filter through it. Unfortunately, most of the time that little extra time leads to, well, now he's no longer open or something else has happened. Scott, if you want to jump in here because this is your area, would love for you to, or if you, or Dub or Will, I know we've talked endlessly about, how we deal with this, how we coach it, how we view it. So I'm just going to open it up to you guys.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add, I think that was a great description, Brandon. Anytime you load up the human brain, whether you are a quarterback or not, with more options, more rules that govern how you select an option, it is a fundamental property that your decision speed and your reaction time slow. You're just slower. And you go from one option to two options. There is a cost in your decision speed, how fast you can react. Even if you're the fastest reaction speed in the world, adding one more option to have to distinguish and determine and discriminate and then react to slows you down. It's just a matter of how much it slows you down when you start loading up options. And so that's what the decision complexity measure captures is when you start loading up options, those who get really high scores, they're losing less decision speed. It doesn't hit them as hard as someone who's low on decision complexity. You're really straining the system. They're really going to slow down when you start adding layers of complexity and more options. So that's the only thing I'd add. There's no way around it. You're going to slow down, but it's a matter of degree with this complexity. So any effort to simplify, chunk, whatever that is, to make that less of a compromise is critical.
It's kind of like the horsepower for the brain, I guess. It makes me think that as we talk about, the layers of learning and then, instinctive, visual and the complexity side of things, it really speaks to, from a coaching style, I think we have to make sure that there's probably a sweet spot closer to the lowest common denominator where we're teaching at a very explicit level. We're not making things over complex. And then, obviously understanding your players' capabilities and what their horsepower is in certain areas allows you to dig deeper into the offense from their perspective. But as a rule, there's probably, there could be some very good explanations there why certain offenses purely, work based on the quarterback's skill sets cognitively. And so when you're a high school coach, there has to be flexibility there because you can't just draft to trade for another guy. Well, some of the high schools in California, they kind of trade for other guys. But you can, just having that sweet spot in your offense where you're teaching the right things, you're allowing them to self-discover, free play, and then as you go, being able to layer things and build up the complexity as needed. But it probably does well for all athletes, if you have a systematic approach where you teach everything, where that can work for the lowest common denominator, right? And then build from there, as opposed to the guys that are just complex off the top. They're going to have a down year when they don't have a guy that can handle that type of workload. And they probably get better as the season goes along if they have an instinctually advanced athlete. But yeah, I think it's so important. This probably speaks, this window, the learning window is probably the most important thing for a coach to understand in terms of getting the most out of your player, in terms of how you structure your offense, how you structure your practices, how you structure your installs. It's probably that area you want to know the most about, so you can do the best. It's really driven. A lot of this is driven by your delivery as a coach, and so I bet you could look and see the coaches that have success have a much cleaner system that works for all levels.
Yeah, Scott, you want to talk about some of the framework for training decision complexity? I think that this is an area where coaches can make some mistakes, right? Because the natural tendency is to, when a kid understands the rules but has low decision complexity, the default is to slow things down, right? And slowing things down is not necessarily what that athlete needs.
Yeah, I think it's an important to distinguish between knowing the rules that govern how you're going to react and being able to execute them, right? Because we've all seen lots of athletes that know the rules. They can get up on the whiteboard and they can they can tell you every rule and every situation, every scenario, but you put them on the field in the action under pressure, and that engages a very different set of brain systems that govern processing what you see and translating into what you do. That's what we're getting at with decision complexity. It's the execution side. So we're assuming you know the rules. But someone with low decision complexity, it just, as you load up rules, they're going to slow down. And so, you know, strategies like Dub has introduced, where you're actually focusing the decision on a very specific set of stimuli and giving some very clear, straightforward rules, or prioritizing what you're looking for first and then moving on if it's not there. Those kinds of cheats are really good. When you're laying out understanding the rules, it is helpful to start with the most frequent and the simplest rules, and you got to practice rules, right? You got to practice executing them. You can't just practice knowing them, you got to actually practice executing them. And it's helpful to do one at a time and develop that kind of automaticity, that rhythm with that particular, I see it, I did this, I see it, I did this. You got to train the brain to recognize a visual cue and, as automatically as it's possible, execute the action associated with that rule. And then you introduce a second rule and you master it, and then you start weaving them in together. It's a building block process. It's tedious, it takes time, but that is the best way to start training rules and layering them on. And you're right, you may slow it down in the beginning just to achieve a little bit of mastery and feel good about, I can do this. But if you only stay at that slow level, you're not going to train to the level of effectiveness that is required in a game where things are happening fast. But I think that's kind of a building block strategy. Independently, start mixing them together, then add a third option, and then starts, automate it, and then mix it in, and you have to decision. You're going to see decision making go down when you start adding 3-4 different reads or options off the same look. I'm curious, Dub, you've done a lot of thinking about how to simplify reads and decision and make complex situations a little more tractable in the athlete's brain. I'd love to hear your thoughts
Yeah.
on kind of these
I think
topics.
there's a few ways to cheat the system or simplify it for your quarterback. And the first thing is your pre-snap process, being able to identify, compartments of the field or sides of space that I can just eliminate based on a pre-snap, process. And so, that kind of offloading those if then things post snap, I guess, pre snap, hey, we're just going to eliminate this side of the field. We're going here. I mean, that's one thing. Another thing is, post snap, being able to get off that first read as fast as possible so I can buy time for my decision making process and eyes and to get to that next set of space. I think that's another cheat code for your quarterbacks that struggle with if then statements. And it is, I have my initial read, my initial route, how fast can I confirm that is going to be open or not, and get off to the next best space, I think is a critical teaching component for your quarterbacks. And most quarterbacks hang on way too long. I think another thing that I've used is just a different language structure in coaching. Instead of using if then statements, I use this unless. And that may not have any bearing on that, but I just feel it's made my quarterbacks more decisive. Like, look, listen, we're throwing the seam here unless we see this one thing, or maybe it comes into two things or three, and we build those building blocks. But for right now, it's one high. We're throwing this seam unless you see collision or unless you see this linebacker do this. Try to make it one thing, and that one thing has to be the highest probability threat to that route. So I think identifying, okay, what's the highest probability threat to this first, route, and then I'm going here unless I see this. I think that's a couple of things that have helped our quarterbacks that maybe have a lower decision-making complexity make faster decisions. And I'll end with just a quick story. I read this the other day. There was a fighter pilot that was being trained by his commander, and he was recounting, like, one of the things that really helped him was most accidents when you're flying a plane occur on landing. So every time you approach landing, you need to front load in your mind. You need to prepare for a flyover. And a flyover is simply, hey, we're aborting and we're reigniting the engine and we're going and we're flying, we're going back into altitude to reestablish, what the issue was. So it could be, whatever, when we're getting ready to land, if there's anything that pops up subconsciously or in our vision that is a threat, or maybe it's a jet on the runway, any last second deal, let's get out of that bad situation, and let's front load our brain to do that. So when it happens, we don't lock up. And so a lot of the landing issues or the accidents occurred from the pilots being caught off guard upon landing. So again, that was something I thought was interesting from a quarterback perspective, preparing, for the worst case scenario, have that front loaded so you can identify it faster subconsciously.
Hey, Dub, I got a question. Your example about the quarterbacks, this unless. I like that. It's setting them up to act, to be decisive. I think that's a really effective way to organize. That's what a hitter does, right? You set up to swing, and then you abort if you recognize something that's not within your approach or your plan. Do you practice that? Do you put guys out there and you give them and you kind of try to lull them in and make them hit the seam, and then you move that linebacker in a way that activates the unless decision. I mean, you got to practice that and train that on the field, not just go through the motions in an off-field discussion.
Correct. So I think now I put this out on Twitter, a year or so ago about, if this unless is better than if then. A lot of coaches are just like, it's the same thing, and it may be the same thing, but for me, just reframing it in that language really helped my guys. I felt like it then made faster, more confident decisions. And so then I would structure, hey, for example, let's take the seam again. We're throwing the seam here on this play unless we see, the linebacker in whatever I gave him, whatever cue I gave him, that was the highest priority threat to that particular route for that defensive look. And so once we drilled that, so I'd give them, like you said, a few open seams, then that would violate, the expectancy that was going to come open, and with that, unless action and whether he executed it right or not, okay, that's the unless. All right, do we got it now? Okay. All right, well, let's go back and let's try it again. So, I think that juggling match really helped our guys accelerate their ability to understand what open was faster.
I think too, just to add on to that, because I think that's a brilliant way to coach, and the payoff is huge. I think that's where you need the permission for quarterbacks to really dig into how far they can push the envelope, their envelope, right? And so, I think one of the things that I found is helpful is utilizing scout team reps as well. Like, putting your quarterback, a younger quarterback, in a situation where, listen, you're going to find a way to throw this, because the defensive coordinator wants this route thrown. Well, let's figure out a way to throw this route no matter what. And how creative and how manipulative you can be with your body and your eyes and your movement. And then forcing them to go down that tunnel, I think is really helpful, to create some good guidelines and rules for quarterbacks to use on the regular gameplay.
Is there a way you guys conceptualize? I know you're mainly at the high school level, but you clearly work with younger athletes and older athletes. Is there a way that you structure the complexity of reads and these kind of things from an age perspective? And obviously, some sports have training age versus chronological age, right? I mean, a kid can be 12 but have been playing quarterback for 7 years. Is there a place and time that you've noticed that there's a sweet spot in that you can add this complexity or work with this complexity?
Yeah, so I mean, for me at the lower levels, and when I say lower levels, probably fourth through seventh grade, for me, it's all about mechanics at that point, and I'm talking about not the mental approach as much. It's just the mechanics of the footwork, your throwing mechanics. I think that's where the emphasis, in my experience, has been better served. Just because the offenses and the defense you're going against at that age are just, I mean, it's a stack box. It's all out blitz. It's kind of hard to, like, drop back and actually have even time to go through two reads. It's impossible. I mean, you're just not going to get that. So um, that's what I see at the lower levels and why it's harder to train, maybe some of those more, complex decisions. It's when you get into eighth, ninth, 10th grade, when the linemen are able to protect a little bit better and athletes are a little bit more developed, that you can get into situations and scenarios where they can make more than one decision.
Yeah, I would echo that, in that it's yeah, sometimes it's literally just like, hey, if you throw the ball to this guy, yeah, and he it's a good throw, it's going to be a touchdown, because like, the lack of structure in defenses works to the advantage of the lack of skill, on the opposition, right? Like, the best way to take a quarterback out of the game is a young quarterback out of the game is eliminate, give them pressure, right? And so that's where we look at it from a fundamental standpoint. If they can have sustainable fundamentals at the low levels, the decision complexity can be probably the least complex out of anything. And I think, but also, I feel like with the younger levels, you also have an opportunity, on the flip side of it, to give athletes maybe a little bit more freedom, and flexibility, because it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter what they do, because it's, who's the greatest all-time sixth grade quarterback? We'll never know, because no one cares. So giving the younger athletes, when they're, at those lower stages of athletic development and cognitive development, pushing them in some areas, and then and letting it, be very simple in others, I think is good. I mean, there's simple things you can probably train from a decision standpoint that actually don't relate to throwing the football. So maybe it's the quarterback flips the run call from right to left if they count a certain number of players on one side, or and again, those are little things you can play around with at that level, where I think there's probably some potential payoff. But I think, if you kind of study, I've spent a lot of time looking into, the concept of, like, ecological dynamics, and how players learn, and the concept of, like, free play. And some of the greatest soccer players of all time have come from the countries where they get the least amount of coaching at a younger level. They're just out playing, and they're playing, and they're creative, and they do things that no one's ever seen. So finding that balancing act, again, I think it speaks to, the we can frequently overcoach athletes at a young age to where they're completely robotic and they're scared to make a bad decision, and they'll work in the confines of the the structure that you put in place. But the minute something goes wrong, it's like it implodes in the face.
Is this the case for Patrick Mahomes, where you look at the
100%.
offense and his style of play in college? Of, I mean, it was almost like, you watch him in college, it looks like it was very loose rules, and he's back there just free playing.
Yeah.
And then now he's, arguably, going to be one of the best, ever.
I,
But having the ability just to be in all those improvisational scenarios in college and getting all those reps. I mean, because they were throwing it, what, 50, 60 times a game?
yeah. I think that's 100% it. I feel like that's even looking back at some of his high school film, you'll see the stuff, you're just scratching your head at like, what in the world? And I think this kind of leads into one of those situations where Patrick was probably always just talented enough to where a coach is gonna be like, I'm just gonna let him kind of do his own thing. And so his ability to explore in tech at Texas Tech was just out of this world. Which and I've gotten confirmation from multiple NFL personnel that some people had him graded as a first round quarterback. Some people had him as low as the fourth round. I mean, there's people that did not think he was going to be a good quarterback in the NFL, and I'm sure it's because they were looking at all the wrong stuff. It's like when people say that Aaron Rodgers has bad footwork. No, he's just on a level of instinctiveness and strategies that are beyond understanding with that much experience. So, yeah, I think, Dub, you nailed it. It's like there's a balance there, and it's like, okay, is that what we're supposed to do with all our quarterbacks now? Is just let them freaking run around and do no-look passes? And
There is one caveat there. Mahomes is blessed with a pretty superhuman brain, so his cognitive capabilities allow him to take advantage of that kind of more dynamic, free flowing. So, whether that's a good training tool for all, or whether that the perfect marriage is you have the brain that can do it, you have the physical that can do it, and you've got the system and the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean it's a great discussion because I don't think it's either or, and it can be a mix. Will, you're working with an athlete right now that we talk about, and that I don't necessarily know that the offense he was previously in allowed his, we're cheating because we know his numbers,
right.
But he's got some cognitive skills that if you let the athlete play, can get it done really, really well.
Absolutely.
I think not, in addition to that athlete, I mean, Jalen Hurts is another example where I feel like in his college offenses, it was the opposite of Patrick Mahomes. He didn't really have that ability to play make. And now in Philly, they're just, he's a couple seasons in and they're finding out what he can and can't do, and allowing him to have a little bit of free play is allowing some things to open up that previously weren't open. Yeah, he's a great athlete, but that doesn't mean that routes become open that weren't previously open, or Jalen being a threat to run then opens up some other things, right? And so I think that they're not just from a scouting perspective, but from a coaching perspective, right? It's like, has this kid been in a place that has allowed that skill set to come out?
Which I think all this is a case for the need for S2 for coaches, right? I mean, we got to know cognitively how he's wired so we can make sure we're putting him in the best possible environment to succeed.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's our argument right now against this whole, like, some of the media pieces have been like the Brock Purdy thing, right? About we're just here to find the highest number. That's not at all what we're doing, right? Two things to that. One is we're not here to predict. We're not here to predict success, because that's never going to happen. You can have guys that have all of the cognitive capability in the world, but don't have the arm talent, don't have the physical skills, don't have the psychological makeup. So we can never predict the future. And second, it's more about finding the athlete who's going to fit your system, fit your scheme, fit the way that you work and the way that he works. knowing how a kid can process information and where his strengths and weaknesses are, you can absolutely say, hey, man, this athlete fits into the goals of what we're trying to do, no matter what that S2 overall number is, right?
To me, it's logical that you would take all the pieces of the puzzle and fit them together. And even maybe, Brandon, not necessarily finding the athlete to fit our system. How can we have our system fit the athlete better, I think, as well, right? And so I think if you're a ball coach and you look at the whole spectrum, otherwise, like, how do we continually explain the success of people that are not supposed to have success based on the traditional attributes of playing quarterback? And so I mean, the combine this year was actually really exciting for me, being someone ironically 6'5". I thought it was cool. There was 4 quarterbacks under 6'1", 3 of them under 6 feet. I think there is a mold that's being broken, but even then, there's another level that we can take it, because, are you going to take the quarterback that has maybe 3 or 4 miles per hour velocity, or the guy that has, a different makeup cognitively, right? So there's all these little things that we should be taking into account, and you can't capture those from putting a guy on a board and saying, draw up this play. You have to understand it, and I think the best coaches out there don't totally understand it, and you see the success teams are having, and it's I'd be excited if I was a coach, to get access to this information and craft my offense in a way that matches the athlete better.
I wanted to make one last point on something Will was talking about, this free play and how much it helps. I think we'll get into that next time when we start talking about executive control. We start talking about improvisation, and there's a lot of value in what you're describing. Putting athletes in compromising positions, putting them in situations where there's unexpected things changing and happening, and forcing their brains to figure out solutions and to adapt and adjust and make mistakes and then correct those. And we probably don't do enough of that with our athletes. There's historically too much emphasis on being perfect, minimizing mistakes. But I think putting them in positions where they're going to find themselves in the game anyway, and preparing their brains to deal with the unexpected and the breakdown and being in compromised positions and situations is absolutely what will push a brain to excel when those things actually happen. So we'll circle back to that, Will. I love that concept.
Well, I do like. I thought it was interesting. You said that the reason Patrick Mahomes is able to do it, well, and not the only reason, but one of the reasons is his brain. But no one has ever said. Everyone's always made it about his unique arm angles and athleticism. Yeah. But here we go. Look, there's other layers to that that's allowing people to do that.
Yeah, you got to be able to do both, right? Yeah. He can do both. Yeah. That's helpful. Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, we'll wrap this one up. I really appreciate your time again. Look forward to one more, which is the motor control aspect, which is a lot of fun. Talk about throwing interceptions, highest predictor of interception rate, quarterbacks who can't deal well with distractibility. And then probably our favorite discussion about the ability to improvise and what that really means at the quarterback position, and how you can coach that into a kid versus coaching that out of a kid, which is really important. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the S2 Cognition Podcast. If you like the content we are putting out, please subscribe with that plus sign at the top of your app, leave a review about the episode, and share it with a friend. Follow us on Twitter at S2Cognition or Instagram at S2.Cognition. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, please visit our website at www.s2cognition.com/podcast. Thanks again for listening to the S2 Cognition Podcast. I'm your host, Harrison Hunter, signing off for now. We'll talk to you guys soon.